Sunshine on the riverside, shadows on the quay. I belong to Glasgow, you belong to me.
Glenlee was built on the Clyde by Anderson Roger at their Port Glasgow shipyard. Her launch was reported in the Greenock Telegraph on the 3rd of December 1896. Shortly after 10 o'clock this forenoon, Messrs A. Roger and Company launched a three-masted bark of 1,490 tons register. She has been built to the order of the Glen Shipping Company and was named Glenlee. The vessel fits out here and will afterwards proceed to Liverpool, where she will load for Portland, Oregon. This was to be the first of 15 long trading voyages for Glenlee, including 4 circumnavigations of the globe and 15 passages round Cape Horn. In 1898, Glenlee was sold to Robert Ferguson and Company of Dundee, and in 1899 her new owners renamed her Isle-a-Mount. She continued on her long ocean voyages under the British Merchant Ensign, including service in World War I, until in 1919 when she was sold to an Italian company registered in Genoa, where she was modernised with a new tween deck fitted with diesel engines and given a new name, Clara Stella. She worked the Mediterranean cargo routes for the next year or so, but the era of merchant sailing ships was coming to an end, and she was put up for sale in 1921. The outlook must have seemed bleak for Glenlee, but fortune had not abandoned her yet. In 1922, the ship was purchased by the Spanish Navy, who converted her as a sail training vessel and renamed her Galatea. This was the beginning of a long and illustrious career for the ship under the Spanish flag. Orgullo de la Nación, pride of the nation, the sailors would sing as they learned their seafaring skills and naval traditions on board the Galatea. She would make 2 or 3 voyages a year into the Atlantic, each voyage lasting about 3 months. Life at sea on board Galatea allowed the young men to develop the teamwork needed to work the ship and master the numerous skills required of officers, petty officers, and seamen. Their service on board forged strong bonds of loyalty and a lasting affection for Galatea. Galatea amassed an impressive log of voyages in her 37 years as a sail training vessel, including service in the Spanish Civil War. Her last voyage as a sea-going training ship was in 1959. She continued to be used by the Spanish Navy in shore-based roles until 1979, when she was retired from service. Galatea still held a special place in the hearts of the many Spanish naval officers and seamen who had sailed in her. But plans to save her for exhibition fell through due to lack of funding. She could have been scrapped at this stage, like so many other old unused sailing ships. Instead, she was moored on a remote quay in Seville, where she fell victim to vandalism, steadily deteriorated, and was virtually forgotten for the next 10 years. But eventually, fortune smiled on her again. In 1990, a British naval architect recognised her as Glenlee, and 2 years later, the Spanish Navy put her up for auction. The Clyde Maritime Trust were galvanised into action.
The auction was bizarre, really bizarre. Getting there was not all that easy, but I arrived at the auction room in the naval base. we were all speaking Spanish, but I did find a very helpful English-speaking lieutenant commander who explained what happens. And the Spanish auction of that nature, what happens is the chairman says the auction has started and says nothing else, and nobody says anything else, and 30 minutes later to the second, the chairman says the auction is now over. At the half hour, they declared the thing finished, and they opened the bids, and it was awarded to us.
Galatea was purchased at auction from the Spanish Navy in 1992 for 8 million pesetas, approximately £40,000. The Clyde Maritime Trust had successfully purchased Glenlee at auction in Spain, but there still remained the daunting task of preparing the ship for her voyage home.
You're not allowed to just tow anything, and least of all a 100-year-old sailing ship, without a permit, which really has to be backed by Lloyd's. So we knew we had work to do. We had the ship surveyed, and we assessed what we had to do, and we wrote up a spec. We spent about £30,000 on essential repair to get her home, and we appointed Murray Scrimger to act for us as a sort of resident engineer.
I'd been told that she was in bad condition, but to find absolutely no mast, and it's no exaggeration to say she had been sunk. The deck house on the poop had obviously been on fire, and it had all sort of collapsed in on itself.
Once Glenlee was approved for ocean towing, she needed a riding crew to work aboard the ship during her final Atlantic voyage.
We appointed Alistair Miller, senior Clyde pilot and a master mariner, and a great chap, Charlie McIntyre, former fitting foreman for John Brown's, and Murray Scrimger, who had overseen the repair work. So those three seemed to be a good mix of trades. We hadn't been able to do an underwater survey, but we'd had her surveyed by one of Lloyd's survey companies, who said she is in good enough order to tow her home. So we arranged for a ocean-going tug from Swansea to come and pick her up. The trip was 9 days, no more than 6 knots. A tow of that nature, all in the open Atlantic, including the Bay of Biscay. Very uncomfortable. So back she came, and that was it, into the dry dock in Greenock. There is only one dry dock really suitable in the area, which is in Greenock. We brought the ship into the James Watt dock, which is immediately next door to the Garval dry dock, and we nudged her in there, and first time we had a proper look at her.
On Glenlee's return to the Clyde, the Restoration Committee that had been formed by the Clyde Maritime Trust got their first full assessment of the enormous scale of the work that lay ahead, and the skills that would need to be brought to bear to restore Glenlee to her former glory.
I started at the bottom. My first kind of duties were digging out the bulges, using jackhammers you see people breaking the roads up with. At that time, the bulges of the ship were filled with concrete and steel filaments, fragments, and this material was removed to inspect the bulges of the ship. That process took about 18 months. In difficult conditions, where you're burning old steel and you hit rust, the cutting stops and the rust spits at you, and the air quality is quite poor. You've got to wear respirators all the time, eye protection, so it's not very pleasant.
After the laborious process of stripping out unwanted ballast and corroded sections of steel, it was time to replace steel deck beams and lay down new decks. The main deck timbers were replaced with opepe, a non-endangered West African hardwood from Ghana. British Steel Corporation generously donated the new steel for the deck beams and the steel deck houses. While the shipwrights laid the decks and the carpenters built the wooden poop structures, the rigging crew were hard at work on Glenlee's masts, yards and rigging.
When the masts and yards came back from Spain, they had been cut into 40-foot sections and transported overland in containers. So if you can imagine, you've got these two huge tubes that you've got to move with chain hoists and gantries to get them to line up so they're straight. It's quite a feat. So this was done with a very simple technique of placing boards at each opening, finding the exact centre of the board in relation to the mast and drilling a small hole. And basically what we did is we'd have 4 stations with these timbers with holes in them, and you had a light source at one end, and if you got it exactly lined up, you'd be able to see through each hole and see the light source. So it's a very simple and effective way to align the masts to be welded back together.
The refitting of Glenlee's masts was an enormous task, requiring great skill, precision and a very good head for heights.
You belong to me, loaded steel and locomotives for India and beyond. Great big ships with their holds all full of whiskey free the pond. Then unloading cargoes of spices, cotton, grain.
When the job was done, she had once again taken on the grace and elegance of a Clydeside tall ship.
Sunshine on the riverside, shadows on the quay.
After a visit to Garville Dry Dock for painting, Glenlee was at last restored to her former glory days of Clyde merchant sail.
To Glasgow, you belong to me.
But the restoration process still continues. In 2011, Glenlee moved to her new berth beside the Riverside Museum.
So in 2010, Mr. Frank Brown and Dr. Christopher Mason asked me to manage and work on the restoration of the poop cabin. It was a mighty challenge. There was cost factors and time deadlines which we had to factor into the whole project. And it was work in which I revelled the opportunity, but it was going to present an awful lot of challenges. Nothing in a ship is straight, nothing in a ship is level. As you can see as you look round, there are curves and bends and arcs everywhere. You can see hardwood finishes is not in the original mahogany because that is a protected species now. It's using a wood called ipepe and iroko. The layout of the poop cabin is as close as we can get it to the original drawing, with captain's quarters, first mate's quarters, second mate's quarters, a galley, a steward's quarters and the cadets. It's pretty much, we hope, as it was when it was first built. A lot of time and a lot of effort went into the making of it, and I'm really proud of the end result.
The work of restoring Glenlee is an ongoing challenge. As you explore the ship, you may well see crew members caulking the decks to keep them weathertight, or aloft servicing her rigging. The crew and volunteers are also busy behind the scenes in the Clyde Maritime Trust's workshops, where they are currently restoring and rebuilding Glenlee's boats. If you would like to help, please consider making a donation, or perhaps you might like to join the Friends of Glenlee, and you can do your part to secure this fine old example of a Clyde-built sailing ship for future generations.